Is this working? Yeah, there. Look at all the people here tonight. Goodness. Live studio audience for our second evening lecture of our summer season. So thank you all for making it out tonight. Thank you to Darlings Hall for being the sponsor of our lecture series. We have lots of folks out in Zoom land as well as in person tonight. So I'm Nick Fisichelli. I'm the president and CEO of the Institute at Acadia National Park. Scooting Institute is a nonprofit partner of the National Park Service and a center for inspiring science, learning, and community for a changing world. So science for change is really our mantra here, ongoing and future changes and engaging people in the science and solutions. You know, that the future is going to look different from the present or the past, and that we need science to help inform the decision-making processes. And this is especially true for what we do that's focused on protected areas. This is also for the commons, which is the theme of tonight's talk. And so I'm super happy that we have a special guest speaker to talk on this. But before I introduce Paul, I just thought, let's see who's in the audience tonight. So I know we have a group from Massachusetts Maritime Academy. Where are you all? All right. Ooh, look at how many we have. Awesome. Nice. We have a group of citizen scientists here on an Earthwatch expedition. Where are you all? All right. Nice. We have many of our early career fellows, interns, and technicians here with Scooting Institute. And we have some members of the local community that made the beautiful drive out this evening. Yes. All right. Well, let's see. So yeah, certainly the commons, such as the coastal waters here of Maine, has been a very sort of hot topic recently, and we wanted to bring in an expert in this field. And I'm thrilled to have Paul Anderson with us tonight. Paul is the executive director of the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries. Paul has nearly 40 years of experience working with Maine's marine resources, primarily public service roles at the intersection of science, policy, and community. So before joining the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries, Paul was the executive director of Sea Grant, and let's see, he also holds a bachelor's and master's degrees in microbiology from the University of Maine and currently resides in Winterport, and made the trek over to be with us today. So Paul, thank you first off for your almost 4 decades of service to the coast of Maine, and look forward to learning more from you about competing for the commons. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. And thank you all for coming tonight. Appreciate that. Yeah, I run a nonprofit organization, and so I just want to take a second before I start to acknowledge Nick and his staff, congratulate them on the great work that they're doing, and thank their board of directors, I think many of whom might be here tonight. And just remind you that the inner workings of nonprofits is complicated and incredibly satisfying when you get it right. And I think he's got it right. This is a new talk for me. It's the first time I've done it, but a pleasure to try it out on you. I've talked about many of these themes separately over my career, but given where I am right now, I thought weaving them together would be an interesting thing for me to do. I had fun doing a little bit of research to bring this to you, tell you a little bit more about, that's not going. I thought the arrow was supposed to work, Sarah. All right, just a little bit more about me. You heard a little bit, just so you know who you are listening to tonight. Yeah, I got my degrees at UMaine in microbiology. I really haven't done a whole lot of bench science in quite a long time, but I ran the program at Maine DMR that opens and closes clam flats. So my background is in water quality, environmental monitoring, and so forth. And then, as Nick said, I went back to the University of Maine where I ran Sea Grant. And I also was the director of the Aquaculture Research Institute and a large $20 million NSF project over 5 years called the Sustainable Ecological Aquaculture Network. So I got myself embroiled in all of what could sustainable aquaculture look like here on the coast of Maine. That's one of the themes we'll touch on tonight. While in those points of service, I had a couple of other opportunities that will come out in the conversation. One, I chaired the governor's task force on marine aquaculture back in 2003. And then following on to that, we explored something called bay management, trying to figure out some of what we're talking about tonight is how do you try to manage and understand these complex ecosystems while also supporting working waterfront and the people that live, work, and recreate here. And then I went to the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries in 2017, and I'm retiring this summer. So this is probably my last talk to a group, so I'm glad you're here. The center's based over in Stonington. I hope you've been to Stonington. If you haven't, you should. Stonington, Maine. It's the largest lobster landing port in Maine, and therefore United States, and in all likelihood, the world. And so there's a lot of fishing activity going on right outside our building. We're on the harbor there. Our mission is to help conserve and sustain commercial fishing in the communities that depend on it in Eastern Maine and beyond. So that's a really important mission. We accomplish that through a lot of collaborative work. I have a small team of 10 people doing collaborative research, collaborative education, and collaborative management. And a lot of that work weaves together into some of the goals and aspirations of what we're here to talk about here tonight. If you get a chance to come over there, on site we have this thing called the Discovery Wharf, which is an interpretive center. It's a lot of fun. We have a retired fisherman, Captain Leroy Weed, who will host you and your family for a visit there with a touch tank and virtual reality setup and some other technology to talk about fisheries and ecosystems. So visit us if you can and would like to. So tonight, the title of the talk, Competing for the Commons on the Coast of Maine. Broken into these pieces here. I'm going to talk a bit about what are the commons and what's the public trust role of our government and therefore us in helping to manage those commons. Who's using these commons? They feel like they're getting more and more cluttered. And I suspect you're all seeing that in your own lives. A little bit about how we try to manage and govern the uses in these spaces and oversee their environmental quality. And then I'll finish with a few ideas that I have from my career on innovations that might give us some opportunities in the pathway forward. This is really my dilemma, our dilemma. It's a long paragraph, but I'll go through it. How can we balance local norms and values and honor those traditions without being enveloped in nostalgia that prevents us from innovating so that we can address challenges due to changes in our natural system, changes in our social system, and all that while simultaneously achieving conservation goals and allowing for local prosperity. A lot of words on that right there. But I think that's some of the dilemma. So these are words that I'd like you to focus on just for a second around balancing conservation and prosperity. One of my board of directors, who comes, very knowledgeable man, comes from investment bank background, told me that this is impossible. You cannot balance conservation and prosperity. That's one of a few things I disagree with him on. I'm going to invoke several smart people that have come before us. And first one is him, Mr. Dillon, Nobel laureate. Come gather around, people, wherever you roam, and admit that the waters around you have grown, and accept it that soon you'll be drenched to the bone if your time to you is worth saving. And you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone, for the times they are changing. On the side, I'm a musician. I was going to try to sing that to you, but I didn't. So I know he's a visionary philosopher kind of dude, but it's hard to imagine in 1963 that Bob Dylan was thinking about climate change. No, probably not. But metaphorically, it works. the sea level's rising, the times are indeed changing. More from Mr. Dillon in a little while. But let's talk a little bit about the commons. So what are the commons? These spaces out there that we all enjoy and love, sometimes love them to death. They're the cultural natural resources that are accessible to all members of society, including natural materials such as air, water, and the earth that we walk around on. The original term commons comes from old Europe, where they would have common properties in a village green, and if everybody had some cattle or some livestock they needed to graze, they could. And there was an agreement, and as long as there were only so many cattle involved in this common space, it worked. There was enough grass. And but over time, they realized people wanted more cattle. They had bigger families. They had more needs. And so they begin to crowd this commons. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But what needed to happen there was those communities had to have some shared visions and some shared ideas on how that common space could be managed and sustained over time. And this was a long time ago. But today we think of the commons as other things beyond the common in your town green, but it includes our public parks, like the one you're sitting in, the roads, the air we breathe, as I mentioned, the water we drink. These are all common pool resources. For tonight, we're going to focus really on the coastal pieces because there's just so much complexity to all of that. But it brings up the question of who can access the commons, who maintains them, and what are the shared responsibilities for those of us that use the commons either in an extractive way or in other more benevolent ways. So you can't talk about this without talking about the tragedy of the commons. And many of you are probably familiar with this. This came up at dinner briefly with Tim tonight. The idea around this theory that Garrett Hardin named actually was born long ago in England. A writer in 1833 by the name of William Forster Lloyd talked about this theory where humans are going to burn up and use everything they can get their hands on and take the last one if they can. But that's just the way it works when we're starving for extractive resources. Essentially, it becomes greed. It's like, okay, there's a human dimension, greed. It was Hardin in 1968 who published this paper in Science magazine that talked about naming this thing, the tragedy of the commons. And he essentially said that ruin is a destination towards which all men rush, each pursuing his own best interest in a society that believes in freedom of the commons. So what he's saying is that if we're left to our own devices and the commons are open and free to all, we're going to go in and use it. We're going to eat every blade of grass. But I would actually posit, and we'll make the point of hope tonight, that we can achieve shared responsibility and stewardship of those common spaces if we're equipped with good information and fortified with local values and local commitment. So that will be some of what you're going to listen to me talk about. And then I hope if I do this on time, we'll get to do some discussion and get your feelings on that. But I'll come back to that in a moment. As we think about the commons, though, what's the role of the trustee and the public trust doctrine? So the public trust doctrine actually was born and came over from England as well. It was actually initiated back in Roman times, and it states essentially that the state has control over these certain resources. Notably the access to the water that we're going to talk about tonight, and all in trust for the citizens of the state. State could be anything you think of, government, and that all of those uses should be made available to everybody as part of the public trust. It was actually this Roman emperor, Justinian, who was a Byzantine emperor out of Turkey, who gave us much of what we now use in common law. And it's interesting that back in 530, this stuff emerged and stayed in civilization and ended up in British law and eventually came over here. It was Justinian, this is a translation, of course, The public use of the seashore too is part of the law of nations, as is that of the sea itself. Therefore, any person is at liberty to place on it a cottage to which he may retreat, or dry his nets there and haul them from the sea. For the shores may be said to be the property of no man, but are subject to the same law as the sea itself and the sand and the ground beneath it. Essentially, he's starting a mantra that has become our law around those common spaces in the coastal zone where you can fish, fowl, and navigate. But there's no permanent private property ownership. That stuff emerged through into European law, and the King of England used this to talk about title and navigation as being open to the public trust. It came over to the colonies, Massachusetts Bay Colony, and adopted it into their ordinances in 1647. And this is where the parlance of fishing, fouling, and navigation came into effect. Massachusetts became a state and adopted this into their own law. And then when Maine separated from Massachusetts in 1820, we carried this forward to ourselves. So a question is, in practice, did this designation of coastal waters as commons necessarily mean it would be maintained and that there would be stewardship to protect it? And I would argue, no, that was not enough. That's not sufficient. And we'll talk about some of those failures tonight. Important to acknowledge too, that colonial forces that arrived in North America beginning in the 14th, 15th century were encroaching on land that was already inhabited. There was already people here. And it turns out some of those people had some really good ideas about governing their society and about managing their sustainability and what the resources that they need. And so the Iroquois Nation, confederacy of tribes in this part of North America, had developed several different principles really that held over. And our forefathers here in the United States used some of those principles around governance and government. They had kind of a senate, and it was very similar. And so some of our forefathers borrowed from their thinking on how to do collaborative government. And one of the things that Hiawatha, the chief at the time, had come up with was a 7th generation principle, which says it mandates that the tribal leaders, decision makers, would consider the effects of their actions and decisions for descendants 7 generations out. 7 generations out. That's pretty impressive. We don't do that. I would argue we don't necessarily look 7 days out, but perhaps we should. So much of what we want to talk about today, I just want to back up a little bit and think about some of the policies as this is unfolded here in the United States. So it's important to think about the submerged lands and that land located between the high tide mark and the low water mark. Definition of that varies a little bit from state to state, but that's loosely what it means. We had the Submerged Lands Act of 1953 that set up the 3-mile limit. That's when states got this 3-mile permission. And then states' own public trust doctrines treat that a little bit differently. Here in Maine, it does come back to this fishing, fouling, and navigation. One more person I want to talk about before I jump into some of the governance stuff, and that's Eleanor Ostrom. This is a woman who got a Nobel Prize in economics. She was a Nobel laureate in 2009. And she really flew in the face of what Hardin assumed. Hardin assumed that the only way to get control and management, sustainability out of these common pools was to either use taxation or government regulation. And those are probably true, but Eleanor argues that they're not the only way. And she would argue that common resources are, when well managed by those communities that benefit the most from them, and that their regulations should be addressed the local level through farmers, communities, and local authorities and NGOs. So she's arguing that we can actually come up with governance systems that start touching on some of that dilemma that I shared with you earlier about finding that conservation prosperity balance through local values and local heritage and local stewardship. And so that's that's some of where we're going to go tonight. She actually used social ecologic systems, a little bit of jargon for you, SES, social ecologic systems. So this is a blending of the social part of our world and the ecological part of our world. Eleanor's diagram has these 4 pieces to it that are important. I've superimposed on them some images of our own fishery situation here in Maine. So up on the top left for you is the resource system. And so that's the bigger kind of biogeographic system that has lots of natural and social features in it. The resource units are down there in the corner. In that case, it's the lobster. So we're talking about units within that system that we're either extracting or counting, enumerating, assessing, and trying to find value from. And it could be any number of things. Up on the right is a governance system, which tends to be, in our society, government. I'll argue that that doesn't have to be the only player in the governance corner. And then finally, the users have to be part of this. And that is the people who are benefiting from the resources, stewarding the resource system, and participating in political processes that create our governance system. It's really not the 4 corners that matter in this diagram. It's the interconnections. It's the lines and arrows in between them that matters. It's the interactions of users with the system, of government with the users. And through this process, she argues that if you embed this within other ecosystems, maybe on a global scale, maybe on a Gulf of Maine scale, you start to understand how other motivators and other factors drive what's happening within this circle. And similarly, at the top, you have the social and economic and political settings that are unfortunately a reality for all of this, because you all are smart, but not everybody in your neighborhood is as smart as you. And so unfortunately, we have that conundrum of society and humanity and trying to figure out how we can get buy-in, how we can get collective, productive participation. So this is the social ecologic systems wheel that I've had a lot of fun learning about. And I'm going to talk a bit about some of the programming that we're trying to do at MCCF that kind of uses this as a framework for thinking about interdisciplinary science, thinking about how to fill data gaps, thinking about what are the critical measures that we ought to be keeping our finger on to tell if we're failing or if we're succeeding. So I was going to finish that sentence. I think there needs to be a t-shirt that says, "It's the ecosystem, stupid." Arguably, all of what I said, everybody wants to maintain the quality of the ecosystem. Nobody wants to mess it up. And so a lot of times it's inadvertent, but it happens. And so some of the concerns that are embedded in some of our aspirations and goals include watching out for extinction of species, impact on public health. We all care about that, right? The ecosystem services, that is the passive role, sometimes active role that the ecosystem itself plays around us. Not extractive, but just being there as a reliable backyard. The conservation biology and ecology movement was emerged over the last, say, 50 years or so about thinking about these kinds of concepts as opposed to in single disciplines. And then biodiversity and the notion that we have to perpetuate and preserve as much biodiversity on the planet as we can. Those factors at the top of that list really, I think, drove a lot of what happened in the 70s. Now, not all of you were alive in the 70s, and I was a little boy. It wasn't a great time for music, I can tell you that. But it was an important time in our government's history. And that's just a list of some of the things that happened in 1970. We had the Environmental Protection Agency was created in 1970. President Richard Nixon signed the authorization to create the EPA. We had the Clean Air Act. We had the Clean Water Act. NOAA was created, which is an important agency, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. First Earth Day happened in 1970. And our Coastal Zone Management Program, which some of you may or may not know about, is a piece of NOAA's programming right now to help us think that, whoa, we got a coastal zone and we ought to manage it? Yeah. So the 70s ended up being an important step But I think this is not enough. Some of what we'll talk about tonight is both the shortcomings, the well-intentions of these authorizations and these laws, but the shortcomings. And so I think we have an opportunity here in the Gulf of Maine to set up systems that use legislation like this, that use science, use technology to measure better, use modeling and computers to model the relationships better, so that we can manage these resources in a way that's responsible, fosters that resilient coastal ecosystem that we need to have. It needs to be resilient, and balances conservation and prosperity. But the pressures are mounting, right? So who's using the commons? In our public forests, we allow extractive use of our forests. They're governed, that's allowed. We have, of course, scenery, people using public spaces. Tamara and I just walked out on the point down here. What a beautiful spot at Schoodic Point. And that has value to all of us and to our society. We have our beaches that some of them are public and deserve care and taken care of. Our groundwater resources, whether it's bottled and extracted like this picture indicates, or your own well water that comes up through your well into your house, those are public resources to some degree. And then just the scenic vistas, the view shed. What's the value of scenery to our community? Trouble is that ecosystem has services to provide, and some of that is receiving the stuff that we get rid of. And so the consequence of some of that might be water pollution or air pollution. And those rules, those things that I just mentioned, of course, are intended to try to control, manage, mitigate some of these impacts to preserve ecological integrity, but also to safeguard public health. If we drill a little bit into a couple of the key user communities of our coastal zone, we're going to talk about commercial fishing, we're going to talk about aquaculture, and we're going to talk about ocean renewable energy. For commercial fishing, it's a public resource. That lobster that you catch out here in Winter Harbor belongs to the paper boy in Lincoln, Maine. But the fisherman has permission and follows the rules and gets a permit to do that. It's a privilege for him or her to do that, but there's a rule in place to make sure that he or she deserves to have that license. They have to follow these rules, the regulations. Right now, there are 96 different permits in the state of Maine. The Department of Marine Resources issues 96 different permits for different types of harvest, of different species. That's pretty amazing. But fishermen, to keep those licenses, they have to comply. There's enforcement. They have to comply with the rules. And I think arguably the lobster fishery here in Maine is probably one of the most sustainably managed fisheries on the planet. And it's really well done. And except for a lot of the externalities that you saw in the SES wheel, if it weren't for those externalities, some of the threats to our lobster fishery would be less than they are right now. Here in Maine, you can't transfer those licenses. You finish the year, you either re-up, buy another one, or you give it up. You can't give it to your son or daughter, and you can't sell it. There are different opinions about whether that's appropriate or not. In federal fisheries, last bullet here, they are transferable. And there are other protocols that drive fisheries management in the federal arena that are somewhat different than the state. So again, we go back to the 1970s, 1976, a couple of senators, Ted Stevens from Alaska, Warren Magnuson from Washington, got together with probably a whole bunch of really smart staff and came up with the Magnuson-Stevens Sustainable Fisheries Act of 1976. Signed by President Ford. It was largely, at that time, there were factory fishing boats, huge, bigger than this building, fishing just off the coast of Maine. They were from Russia and from other parts of the world coming in and overfishing and really doing havoc. So in some ways, this was a protectionist strategy, but it also has conservation intent, including setting up regional councils. There are 7, 8 regional councils around the country that look at their own regional issues and needs and engage local fishermen and local government in that. This law established the 200-mile limit for the United States, taking it beyond that 3-mile that we talked about a moment ago. And its intent was to prevent overfishing, to rebuild stocks, implement science. Remember, NOAA had just been born. I don't think the Fisheries Service had been created yet, but it would soon come along, and they start trying to count fish. Pretty hard sport, but they do it. And of course, this wanted to increase the economic activity of fisheries here in the nation and feed our own people with quality fish. Marine aquaculture has a kind of a similar story, different, sort of expedited, shorter story. Started in the 80s, really here in Maine in different forms. It's been steadily expanding. In this case, growers are granted leases for exclusive use of a spot. Fishermen fish where they can and want to. They have essentially a lease, but they have a permit for a spot, but it's not very big. And then they lay down lots of spots. Aquaculture gets a fixed spot somewhere in these common places to cultivate a variety of species, including fish, shellfish, sea vegetables. So a few images here. These are polar circle salmon pens, like the ones located up in eastern Maine and different places, mostly up in Cobb's Bay area, growing salmon for the most part. These operations are fed, so they actually have to feed these animals, whereas other types of aquaculture in Maine generally do not have to be fed. And with that feed comes different concerns about what are you putting into this ecosystem. And when you take those fish out, what's left? This is an artist's imagery of a fairly new technology, and that's a feeding barge that is very high tech. There's a whole wheelhouse with instrumentation and screens that tell the operators when to feed those different pens and how much. There's cameras that record when the feed gets down so far. It's because fish have already eaten enough, excuse me. They stop feeding, so they stop feeding them food. And so that's just an image of some of what's going on these days. There's not a lot of pen aquaculture in Maine, but it's focused primarily up there in eastern Maine. There's other types of aquaculture, of course, and Maine cut its teeth on both mussel and oyster aquaculture back in the late 80s into the 90s. Really took off. This is a mussel raft. It's a raft that hangs lines, and the mussels bind to the lines with their byssal threads, and they grow within a couple of years. You pull these up, and you have mussels to eat. If they're grown in the right place, you don't have to feed them. They're just feeding on phytoplankton in the water. They take up space. There are other ways to grow mussels. You can grow them on the bottom as well. Oyster aquaculture has similar kind of infrastructure, but different. And this is a string of oyster cages that are being managed and manipulated. They have to be flipped occasionally. And, but they're all embedded within a leased area where that grower has permission. We dabble in a lot of different kinds of shellfish now here in Maine. So this is just an image of some baby soft shell clams that are going to go out in the flats. Scallop aquaculture is taking root over the last, say, 5 or 10 years. And there's a few operations that are using different husbandry techniques. I'm skimming through a lot of this. I could do a whole day-long talk on aquaculture, but not what we're going to do. And then more recently, seaweed, sea vegetable aquaculture has shown up. And this is an image of kelp lines that are being grown in these places. So there's been a steady growth of aquaculture since the 80s. A little bit of data for you, for example, comparing 2014 and 2020. So in 14, there were 150 standard leases in Maine. And in 2020, there was 187. So there's a slight growth uptick going on with the number of leases. The total acreage under cultivation right now is just under 2,000 acres, 1,785, 68. I can't read. So there's not a lot of acreage in aggregate, but depending on where it is and how it's located matters. And so the maximum lease size right now is 100 acres. That's a sizable lease, and there aren't very many of those. And the average lease size right now is 14 acres. So again, there's a distinction between the culture of finfish and the other species that are listed here because the other species don't require inputs. We're not putting anything in the water. We're not putting food, carbon, nutrients, contaminants. In fact, those species are probably extractive of those kinds of features. But lately, you've heard, if you're here in Maine, you've heard that land-based aquaculture is taking root. This has happened, around the world in different scales and different places for different species, and it's for some reason shown up here in Maine in spades over the last few years. And there's a few operations in Midcoast. This is a artist rendition of what would be in Bucksport, Maine, called Whole Oceans. I think it's a 9-acre building. I think that's right. It's big. It's right on the water there in Bucksport. There's similar, and this would be what they call a recirculating system. They'll bring seawater in, grow their fish of different sizes for a certain amount of time in pens and cages inside, and they're bleeding water constantly, some level of water that's been treated, presumably, and if permitted properly and the technology works, presumably they're not impacting the ecosystem. I don't know enough about the details of that to know whether that's true, but it's apparently a lucrative sport because we've got Nordic Aqua Farms wants to do this in Belfast, Maine, and Kingfish Aqua Farms, Kingfish Maine wants to do this in Jonesport. And in Kingfish case, they're not growing salmon, they're growing cereola or help me out, Bill. What's the other name for cereola? It's the yellowfin. Yellowfin that's popular in sushi. So, so having said all of that aquaculture is coming and it's one of these features that's competing for our commons, I do think there's a place for aquaculture here in Maine. It needs to be integrated carefully with commercial fishing. I don't like how polarized those two sectors have become. They share knowledge, they share capacity around seafood jobs, they share access to markets, they share beautiful, cold, clear water here in the Gulf of Maine. And so I think if we think through what the challenges are on this stuff, we can find that balance between conservation and prosperity. One of the things I don't understand, because I'm not an economist, is why all the foreign money? So all three of those operations are being heavily capitalized by foreign money from other places on the globe. If these are such good ideas, where's the US capital? Where's the investment from our communities so that some of that prosperity can stay here instead of boards of directors for somebody in Norway? So that sounds very protectionist, really. But I honestly ask that question: where's our investment, where we can get investors to buy into sustainability here and buy into the importance of our coastal communities? Obviously, at a global scale, we're in the crosshairs as a target for a lot of these kinds of activities. And aquaculture isn't the only one. Renewable energy seems to be following a similar pattern. So this is another one of the third conflicting use that, or competing use that I want to just touch on tonight. Our legislature made this statement, a series of statements here in 2009 that said that there's an opportunity for ocean-based renewable energy. Climate change is happening. It requires renewable energy to meet the energy needs of Maine and the nation and the world. There are appropriate technologies to try to mine and farm energy, either through wind or other renewable types. And this is the important piece here, that it's worth the cost, assuming a set of provisions about compensation for harm to existing uses and restoration if needed, and a compensation to the public. So there's an acknowledgement here in our state legislature statement that this might cost. We have to make choices. There are decisions to make, and there might be impact. We want to understand those impacts, mitigate them if we can, but certainly control them if we have to. So essentially, that's our trustees making that decision for us, that we have to do this. The planet needs to stop burning fossil fuels. And so there's going to be trade-offs and choices to be made. I don't know if this comes out very good. But real quickly, there's a bunch of activities going on in the offshore renewable wind energy space that are somewhat pictured on this map. I actually serve on the fisheries working group of what's called the the Offshore Energy Roadmap. And this is a multi-agency industry partnership trying to figure out if we're going to have renewable energy in the Gulf of Maine and off Maine's coast. What's it going to look like? What are the various parts to making those decisions for development, help developers do it right? What are the things we need to monitor? What are the opportunities through ports and harbor infrastructure to figure this out? And right now, Maine has a moratorium on installations within that 3-mile line. Governor Mills signed that last year. But we don't have control over outside of 3 miles. That's controlled by the Department of the Interior, something called the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. Right now, that picture that I just showed you is a floating turbine that University of Maine invented. They've patented it. And there's a consortium called New England Aquaventus that is a combination of developers and scientists and researchers that are going to put one of those off of Monhegan Island in Maine. This is exempted from the moratorium that I just mentioned. And they're going to put that out there in a couple of years, 2004, 2005, and they're going to test how that works. You know, does it meet its demands? What's it doing to the ecosystem? And so that is in the works and is going to happen. Simultaneously this year, this other polygon further down off of Portland, if you know your geography, the tiny or deep red squiggly thing, that's the target area for what will be an offshore research array, where up to 12 of those kinds of floating turbines will be installed sometime over the next maybe 10 years, maybe more, and put them in an array so that the researchers can study more of aggregate impact kinds of things, what happens around these arrays. Of course, the fishing industry has a lot of concerns about this, messing with the ecosystem, messing with the oceanography, messing with the bottom. How close can you fish to these things? What happens when they transmit lots of energy through a cable on the bottom of the ocean? What goes on? Those are some of the questions that are being asked, and we don't have the answers. And the hope, the presumption is that this research array helps us to get there. So again, to the premise of my talk tonight, how do we balance and accommodate these interests, take advantage of the opportunities, contribute to food systems, reduce burning of fossil fuels while being good stewards and taking care of this precious place we have in our backyard? I want to move on to the final piece here. I'm going longer than I thought, Nick, but around some of the methods and innovations and some of my experience where I've seen that we can go in terms of getting a handle around some of these things that we're talking about tonight. The first is marine spatial planning. I'm going to touch on bay management a little bit, and I'm going to finish with a little bit on ecosystem-based management. So marine spatial planning isn't a new idea, but it's this idea that we can do modern cartography and start layering information that we know around a space, spatial, and do better planning. It's essentially zoning in the ocean. But you got to know what's there. You got to know what the pieces are and who's using what. All those things I just described for you. We got to know more about where they are in space, where they are in time, where they overlap, where they maybe conflict. And here's a schematic, an example of a marine spatial plan diagram from Belgium, Northern Europe. Back in Sea Grant days, I attended a bunch of conferences trying to figure out, all right, how do we do this stuff? Can we do this stuff? Do we have the right information? At that time, GIS for me was brand new, Geographic Information Systems. We were digitizing everything you could find, and we digitized a lot of junk. And so my fear was that we would all of a sudden create these beautiful maps layered with junk and start believing what those maps said. Fortunately, since then, that whole technology has improved. We have standards around data collection, standards around data management, standards around how to portray and analyze spatial features through geographic information systems. And so here in Belgium, you can see they got a marine protected area here on the right. They have what they call extraction areas. They have zones for renewable energy. So some of what I just talked about, they're trying to map this out. Some of the challenges with this approach, though, are that things change. Remember Bob Dylan? times are changing. And I asked the leader of our aquaculture industry many years ago, I said, so why can't we figure out on the Maine's coast, where could we do aquaculture? Where could we grow oysters? Where could we grow salmon? And where can't we? And he was loath to answer that question. And he said, because things change, Paul. Things are going to change. There might be other species. There might be other husbandry techniques. Here we are. He was right. We got other species. I just showed them to you. We got other techniques. We can grow things in different parts of the coast than we thought we could 20 years ago. So had we locked ourselves into a marine spatial plan around aquaculture 20 years ago, we might have done a disservice to ourselves and to the industry or our communities. Same with fishing. Fishing changes. Fish move. The ecosystem changes. And so how can you map out where the habitat's going to be right for ground fish in 20 years? We barely understand what the habitat needs are now. It's kind of like what Nick will tell you about forest ecology. And that is when you're conserving and managing forest ecology in these public spaces, you can't manage for yesterday. You can't be nostalgic. You got to manage for tomorrow. You got to understand what the change is going to be. Wayne Gretzky played good hockey, not because he went to where the puck is, because he went to where the puck is going to be, right? So the conundrum here is, how can we use this kind of a tool in a changing world? And I think the only way to play this game is to have more information. So the Northeast Ocean Data Portal is an amazing tool. If you haven't seen this, write it down, go check it out. There's dozens and dozens of data layers that will give you more information than you can possibly use. But it's there to see. For instance, that's commercial fishing trips over a 10-year period through vessel technology, tracking technology. That's kind of a useless map to many degrees, but it tells its own story, and you can tease that apart. This is a map of marine aquaculture in Maine, right? It's fairly discrete, and it's cool because you go click on each of those dots, it'll tell you a little bit about that farm. This is recreational activities along the coast of Maine. So just an example of these kinds of layers, if you layer them on one another, maybe you start to get a handle of what actually is going on in your area, so that you can perhaps fill in some gaps, try to tease it apart, understand more what that data means, and think about what the aggregate impact might be. And perhaps it begins to inform some policy and practices. Bay management was an attempt to try to do just that on a very micro scale. And I participated in the Bay management planning effort back in 2005. That one piece of that was to do a pilot area in Taunton Bay. Anybody know where Taunton Bay is? Down the road a bit? Yeah. We studied for 5 years that system and created GIS layers, just like you saw, for that system around eelgrass, habitat, harvest, what could be here. And then managed that for about 5 years with the help of the DMR. Several community members were in the mix. Myself, I think I was probably at Seagret at the time. And it kind of failed, but the lessons we learned were these three: that scale matters, and it matters in two ways. The closer you can get to your community, the better you can understand it. So you want as reasonable a scale as possible to understand and to react to it. However, the state was responsible, again, as a trustee, for helping us to manage that information. And they said, we can't do it. We got a lab in Booth Bay Harbor. We got a lab in Lemoyne. We got a handful of staff. We cannot possibly cut the coast of Maine into Taunton Bay sized areas and do the kind of work that's necessary. So scale was a problem with capacity of government support. Inclusion. We were trying to get community people into the tent, trying to get fishermen into the tent, working with scientists and with agency people. And the only people that could show up in the tent were those that had time, that could actually spend time there, either because they're getting paid or they're volunteering, they're retirees, citizens with free time. Very few fishermen have free time. And so it was I struggled with the inclusion, trying to make sure that, well, if we're going to interpret this stuff and try to understand what the impact is or implications on fishermen and regulation and seafood economy, we darn well better have fishermen in the conversation. So that was one of the challenges we learned. And then the burden, again, of getting that data, mapping that data, managing that data, and monitoring what we wanted to monitor just exceeded our capacity. So bay management carries with it those kinds of burdens. I don't think it's impossible, but whoa, that's what PC will do to a Mac PowerPoint. I'm going to blow that off for time's sake anyway. The final piece I want to talk about is ecosystem-based fisheries management. And this kind of blends a lot of what I've talked about already. And this is the notion that you can take a systematic approach, in this case, fisheries management, using a geographic area that contributes to the resilience and sustainability of the ecosystem, and you begin to understand those physical, biological, economic, and social factors. It's Eleanor Ostrom in spades. It's all the pieces and thinking about that in a place and trying to drill into that and understand who's using it, who wants to use it. So we had this really exciting opportunity at Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries in 2017, where we signed a formal agreement with NOAA, DMR, and us to look at ecosystem-based management in Eastern Maine. We're finishing that 5-year agreement right now, and we're about to renew it for another 5. We call it the Eastern Maine Coastal Current Collaborative. And the reason is you have to have an acronym, right, Nick? You gotta have an acronym. NOAA insisted that we have an acronym. Their acronym, of course, is the National Organization of Absurd Acronyms. But so we came up with EM3C to talk about this area. And you can see that geographic gyre that comes down from the Bay of Fundy on the eastern side of the Gulf of Maine. And it comes down roughly to Penobscot Bay and kicks off. It does. Oceanographers discovered this feature back in 1980s or so, called the Eastern Maine Coastal Current. That water does not go to Portland, generally. And so this whole system, by the way, if you're reading the papers, is getting all screwed up right now. But anyway, we based our study on this area that becomes Penobscot Bay to Canada. And we hope in the coming years, we're talking to Canada, recognizing that this is an international opportunity to think about the oceanographic and the biogeography of this area. So now we have a place. The EBFM definition I just described, that you have to have a place to study this. So you can put boundaries around your work. So we have that, and that's pretty exciting. Its objective really is to develop a research framework by which EBM could be implemented, presumably through policy, regulation, through best practices. I argue that we got to get the right people into that tent so that we can get the right interdisciplinary and collaborative knowledge into the space, so we can get local knowledge, local interests into that, people that can think around the corner at their own future, try to identify and organize the research needs, the monitoring needs, take advantage of the technology that's out there for ocean observing and sensor technology and the computer technology to manage that great deal of information. Find the metrics, the critical metrics that we should be measuring and keeping our finger on in the system. And maybe, we hope, inform better policy and practices that create that resilience in the social ecologic system. And wouldn't it be great if we could do that for 7 generations out? So I'm going to close with our Nobel laureate, Bob Dylan. The line it is drawn, the curse it is cast. The slow one now will later be fast. As the present now will later be past. The order is rapidly fading. And the first one now will later be last. For the times, they're changing. Thank you. A few minutes for questions. Way back there. Okay. Yes. Sure. Yeah. And I suspect you're using scale in several different ways. You might be talking about scale of an operation. Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that's unfortunate, I don't have an answer for you, by the way, but bigger is not better, right? When I was a water quality biologist, I learned that building one giant mega wastewater treatment plant for metropolitan Boston, probably not the best idea, because you can't, then you have one outfall, you have concentrated things. So scale matters. You have to kind of distribute that and understand those impacts at a level that you can either control, mitigate, or at least manage. One of the challenges in the aquaculture law here in Maine is there's a provision, there's 7 provisions that the commissioner has to follow to make a decision on leasing, and one of them is aggregate impact. And it speaks kind of to scale. If I have 3 or 4 oyster operations in one estuary, is that too much? I don't know. He doesn't know. We don't have the tech, we don't have the tools, we don't have the knowledge to know. Is that a question about the benthic community? Is that a question about how much phytoplankton is available for those oysters? Because maybe they're going to starve if there's not enough food. We don't have that aggregate impact question, certainly for any of the species that I showed you here tonight. I don't have an answer to your question. It scares the hell out of me to think that wind turbines numbering 200 or 1,000 might be in a field off the Gulf of Maine. You and I won't see them, but they're going to be out there, and somebody better be asking the question about what's the impact and consequence of that scale. Yeah, you're running a big, long extension cord. Well, they have, no, I understand your opinion. But that's, well, people will argue that that's where the wind is. Right. Yep. I hear you. Yeah, they're scary. I hear you. I have a lot of hands. Bill, and then I'm going to come here, and then you, sir. Yes.
Paul, can you repeat the question, please? Because we can't hear it on Zoom.
Yeah. The question for those on Zoom is about the local element between municipal scale, presumably, inter-municipality. I think some of our towns are working really well together. Question of that is that versus the state level. And I attended a series of one of the workshops that DMR held recently on the municipal shellfish. It was really impressive what you're doing in this region. You have 7 towns that are working together, and that allows a whole lot of more fluidity for the clammers, a whole lot more information sharing. One of the conclusions, the group said, we just got to meet more. We got to talk more. The state hosted that workshop, but really the state can't make that happen. They might be able to facilitate it and buy the donuts, but the towns have to make that happen. We're running low on time. Yes, ma'am.
So the question of confidence in the commons seems appropriate. Your organization used to have a slogan of fish forever, which is a confidence in the capacity of the wild ocean to provide for us if we moderate our demands and if we accommodate ourselves to the natural systems that we live inside of. So I'm here on behalf of Seaweed Commons as a kind of freshman class of aquaculture coming in. Hi, nice to see you again. On how do we fit into the ocean versus trying to take what we demand. And, you know, the confidence that Eleanor Ostrom documented, not in theory, but by observing durable economies and durable ecologies in grazing and alpine grazing and river fisheries, irrigation commons that actually had beautiful temples associated with them as well. So long-standing, durable economies based on those wise management practices. But here you have a bunch of young people sitting in a room wondering why should they have confidence in a state of Maine that currently prioritizes the needs of large corporations and that allows Aquaculture Association to define the rules of the law. We should be, as the next generation, co-authors of those governance principles that will guide a future that we're here to suffer from.
Go ahead. Come on. That was good. I'm just going to say thanks to the Zoom folks because it's 8 o'clock. If you have to disappear, go ahead. I'll take one more question back here. So when you're right on Fish Forever, by the way, is a moniker that I inherited from my institution. It was that we would like to be able to fish forever. Therefore, we manage these fish better. But we want to be able to also fish because we're fishermen and that kind of pays the bills. So there was a dual intent there that Robin had when she created that a long time ago. Sir, want a question?
How would privatizing that industry or program work out? Does it increase its chance of success or, yeah.
Involving corporations, yeah. It's an intriguing notion. In my entire career, I've always wanted to engage industry as much as possible in conversations, and sometimes they're at the table and they want to be for genuine reasons, and sometimes they're not. I mentioned earlier, balancing prosperity and sustainability. For us, we have the largest lobster landing port in Maine, right? There's 6 buying stations that I can see from my office window. They're moving a bucket load of lobster, making a bucket load of money. It's a private enterprise, and it's fishermen doing pretty well over the last year. They're not going to be doing so well over the next couple of years. It's a tough game, but that is private sector. So that's a piece of privatization. I like that these people grew up here. They have grandchildren that are going to grow up here, and they have the values, and they want to, if they're going to participate in this kind of work that I'm talking about, they're going to be all in, I hope. I don't know that the well-intended boards of directors of Norwegian offshore wind developers and aquaculture farmers even know Maine's coast. They like Norway's coast probably, and that may be why they're not doing it to Norway's coast. But so there's a trick there, I think, in how to engage and do so with honesty and integrity and with sustainability, looking out front. Some corporations maybe look 7 generations, but I doubt it. I think we have to call it there.
Contribute to balancing conservation.
One thing about get involved. Citizen science is a really cool sport. I'm really proud somewhere back in my career working with women like Esperanza Stanchioff and Kathleen Layden. We were at the point of the spear of citizen science in around 1988, 90, because the state couldn't do it itself. We could not collect enough samples. We couldn't cover what we needed to get the work done that would open clam flats and keep consumers of shellfish safe. So we created a process of engaging local citizens, training them, thanking them, and supporting them, and using their information in a methodical way. And we ended up opening a bunch of clam flats and helping them manage the coast. That's citizen science, and there's plenty of opportunities for any of you to do that, not just water quality monitoring, but I'm sure in forest ecology, there are observing networks for different features. There's a whole phenology network around the country that's looking at lots of different things that change, that appear in the natural world, whose ecosystem and cycles are being messed up by climate change. And there's a whole network of citizens who are tracking those features. And it might be, when did the ice come out? on your pond? When did the lilacs bloom? When did the rockweed bloom? And so that's a phenology network. So I think get involved, learn, participate. Don't stick your head in the sand and believe social media. Get your face off the screen. There's another one. Thank you.